Welcome everybody on this cold day here in Minneapolis. I hope that it's a little warmer where all of you are. We're here to talk today about the global trademark portfolio and how we manage our marks and our intellectual property in a number of jurisdictions as franchisors. We've got a great panel today. I'll do some introductions in a minute, but from a housekeeping perspective, I would say make sure that you're popping questions into the chat. We'll try to keep up as we go along in the chat and answer some of the questions as they come in. If we're not able to get to them as they come in, we'll try to answer them at the end if we have any other if we have time. I will go ahead and introduce myself first. My name is Shelley O'Callahan. I am the Executive Vice President, Legal and General Counsel at International Dairy Queen. We are a global QSR brand. We've got about 7,500 locations worldwide in about 20 countries. So we have and manage a rather large trademark portfolio across the globe. My history, I've been franchising a long time. Before I joined Dairy Queen about 15 years ago, I did some time in the hotel industry on the franchise side and started out my practice as a private practice attorney doing franchise litigation. So I've been a franchising lawyer and by proxy, a little bit of a trademark lawyer for an awfully long time. Jen, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. I am a trademark lawyer. I have practiced in the area of trademark for over 25 years. I am at Taft Law and was previously at Gray Plant Moody, where I got involved with a number of franchisor clients. I have worked in the franchise space on trademark with Dairy Queen for many, many years, as well as Radisson Hotel Group, Choice Hotels, Batteries Plus, Home Instead, a number of small and emerging franchisors. So do have that perspective, but focus my practice at Taft on international trademarks and global trademark portfolio management. Bill?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Glad you all can make it today. My name is Bill Grafe, managing partner of Franchise Law, a small boutique firm out of Philadelphia. I've had the fortune of being in franchise law almost my whole attorney career, coming up on 20 years now, working with another firm, Fisher Zucker in Philadelphia, before I started my own shop. Through that experience, I probably had the opportunity to work with close to 100 franchisors that are either going out of the U.S. into international or vice versa, or some sort of version of the same. I've also had the opportunity to serve on the international committee, the IFA, for probably 8 years now. And being around those people and learning a lot about the international stuff has certainly not only become part of my practice, but is something I'm very passionate about and enjoy working with clients on. So I hope I can share some of that experience with you today.
Great, thank you. Well, as we talked about what topics might be of interest to both the corporate counsel group and the international group for this month's webinar, we sort of landed on this topic. You know, trademarks are really at the heart of any franchise business. You know, when you're selling franchise, a big part of what you're selling is the right to use your marks and your system, of course. And it needs to present a value proposition to your prospective franchisees. It also is the way that you go to market with consumers and how you grow your brand, both from a unit perspective and a business perspective with the consumer. And as you expand internationally, you really want to be able to have a strong portfolio of trademarks to be able to leverage as you want to expand into newer markets. So, you know, decisions that you make around international trademarks are really important and they can really be challenging. There's a lot of different laws, there's different languages. You have to make decisions that are not always black and white. You know, which marks should you register? When should we register? Who should you have helping you make those decisions and who should be doing the registration? And what you learn very quickly is you can spend a lot of money very fast. And so as an in-house lawyer responsible for the trademark budget, that's always top of mind. And we'll talk a lot about that as we go through the presentation today. And I'll try to insert some of my my in-house practical experience to join Jennifer and Bill's more legal experience. We can go to the next slide, Tara. Just to get an idea of our attendees today, I was going to have Tara pop up a couple of polls for us. So if you wouldn't mind participating and letting us know kind of who we have on the line today, and we'll try to tailor our remarks a little bit toward the audience if possible. So we'd like to know, we know some of you are probably attorneys and some of you are development folks and other business folks, but we'd like to understand our audience. As we do that, I might go through the agenda today and we can kind of multitask, I guess, as we go along. Really, we're going to start with going through some international trademark, or we call them basics, but we're really going to talk about kind of the when and the where and the what and the who at a broad basis, to just provide a little bit of a foundation for the rest of the presentation to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll then kind of go into, like I said, maximizing some resources. You know, we don't have unlimited resources as we go into this exercise of trying to protect and register marks throughout all the places that we want to do business. So a lot of it is about prioritization and planning, and a little bit of budgeting. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll then move into some more specific things around franchising. So, you know, anybody who manages a trademark portfolio, there's a lot of things that apply to everybody who does that. But there are some specific considerations and some special considerations when you're a franchise brand. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll move into some more specifics around the Madrid Protocol. For those of you who are familiar with that, that is a way that you can register in a more streamlined way in multiple jurisdictions, and Jen will sort of lead the discussion on that. And that can be particularly helpful for kind of up and coming international franchisors that are maybe just moving into or considering moving into a number of different countries. And then finally, we'll wrap up with thinking about enforcement. So once you've got your registration strategy and you've kind of exercised some of those muscles and you've got a portfolio, now what? What do you do with infringers? How do you enforce? Again, how do you prioritize? How do you monitor the trademarks so that you protect them in a way that so they continue to be valuable and you continue to be able to use them in the way that you intend? So hopefully, I think we've got a lot to cover today. Again, make sure to pop questions into the chat as we go along, and I'll try to do that. All right, Tara, we can. Oh, there we go. There's the poll results.
Nice.
All right, so we've got a good mix.
That's great.
Excellent. Perfect. All right, and did we have another question as well, Tara? I can't remember. I think this was probably enough. I think this is the information we wanted. Okay, so we're good. We will move on. And go ahead, Tara, you can advance the slide. And Jen, maybe you want to jump in and start with our kind of foundational information.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. So all of you on this webinar, I'm sure, are familiar with trademarks, so we don't have to start with a trademarks 101. But trademarks are critical to franchise systems. You're probably familiar with how the process works in the US. I saw from the poll that most participants today have some familiarity with international trademark and do own some registrations outside the US and Canada. But we want to go through some of the specific kind of differences when you go internationally with trademarks so that everyone can understand the kinds of issues you may encounter. So the first thing to understand is that trademark rights are always geographic in scope. That's true in the US, it's true everywhere around the world, meaning that when you have a trademark right, you have it just in that jurisdiction, just geographically limited. So if you own a trademark right in the registration in the US, it doesn't help you in Canada. You need a Canadian registration. And if you have all of North America, it doesn't help you in Europe, right? Every jurisdiction is separate. So you do need to be thinking about where are you doing business, and where might you want to do business, and where would you want to prevent somebody else from using your mark to do business? Because under trademark law, it's really okay for one party to use a mark in one jurisdiction and a different party to use that same mark in a different jurisdiction, right? So if a German company was using your same mark in Germany, that's allowed because it's a different jurisdiction. They're just really separate from each other. But if you then wanted to go into Germany in the future, you wouldn't be able to. So to really just start with that, like very, it's geographic in scope, and you have to be looking at every jurisdiction individually. Now, there's some slight differences to that because the European Union is one jurisdiction that covers 27 countries. So you can get independent registrations in each country, but you can also get a joint, registration that covers the whole EU. But I think the interesting thing about international trademark law is that it is very well harmonized around the world. They have been working since the late 1800s to actually help brand owners protect their brands in a similar fashion in every country on earth. And so you have this very similar structure of laws and process. So you have a trademark agency in the local government. You have an application that asks for the same information. You apply, you pay some fees. It gets examined, third parties have an opportunity to oppose, you get a registration, and then it's good for a 10-year term. So it's very interesting that like it's so separate in each jurisdiction, but the process is almost identical around the world with small variations, right? But the general idea is the same. And then if you want to just think about what does it cost, roughly $3,000 per mark per country is a good rule of thumb to just think about what it's going to cost. It's a little bit, maybe it's 5,000 in the EU, but you get 27 countries. The Middle East can be more expensive. It's just a very expensive legal jurisdiction. Some places can be cheaper, but that's a good rule of thumb. One thing to think about the US versus international trademarks is that the US is a particularly difficult jurisdiction worldwide to obtain a trademark. We have a very rigorous examination process in the USPTO. We have very specific rules. You get a lot of office actions. So one thing we have what's called relative examination, so that the trademark office won't allow you to register a mark that's too similar to something that's already registered. That is not true around the world. Many countries will allow two marks to register that are super similar, and they basically expect you to oppose if you have a problem with that, if you're the earlier registrant, right? So the examination process is a lot easier, right? So I think when people think about like, oh, I have to go all these places, it's going to be super difficult. It's one thing to realize is the US is one of the most difficult jurisdictions to get, and so it won't be as hard. Sometimes it goes right through when you're doing international trademark registration. The other big difference is in the US, you have to use a mark if you're a US company to get a registration. So you can apply on an intent to use basis, but you have to put the mark into use to eventually get a registration. So it's a real difference that most other countries do not work that way. You are allowed to just go and register your mark, even if you're not there yet. And so that's just a big head switch, right? To think about, like, I can just go do that, right? There's all this rigmarole in the US, but if I want to register in 10 more countries, all I have to do is apply, and I can go kind of reserve the right to operate there in the future.
And that allows you to think about, and have a little bit of strategy, right? And that leads to this discussion about, where do you want to file? Because of course, you want to file in the places that you for sure know that you're going to do business, immediately. But, maybe you have a long-term plan where you've got an expansion and a strategic plan. How can that play in then to how you're going to register your marks?
Yeah, and people will say like, well, I'm not ready to go into Canada yet. Well, you don't need to be ready. Like, go ahead, get Canada in the beginning. That's not a big deal to think that you might go in Canada. So, right, even for a small US franchisor, it's $3,000 to sort of reserve your rights in Canada. Maybe Mexico, right? Maybe EU. Maybe for $4,000 you get 27 countries of the European Union. One thing to note is the UK is not part of the EU any longer, and so like you might think about the UK, the EU, Switzerland, and Norway, which are other jurisdictions that are not part of the EU, as kind of typical jurisdictions. And so while you don't have to have use like you do in the US, the flip side of that is that those countries operate on a first to file system, meaning the party who gets the trademark rights in that country is the one who files the application first. So they don't have to use it. They don't have to have operated a store. They don't have any use obligation. But if they filed for your mark in a country, they can stop you from using that mark in a country. They are the ones who own it. They were the first to file, and that's how those countries operate. And so that's the other reason, sort of defensively, you need to be thinking like if you ever want to go into Europe to like get that registration before somebody else does. That's the other reason to do it. Not so that you have it, but to make sure somebody else doesn't get it. There's a lot of famous cases where this has been a problem for brands. Starbucks, when they tried to enter Russia, some Russian International had registered Starbucks, and it was a long, protracted legal battle for Starbucks to be able to probably finally acquire those rights and operate in Russia. And again, while they are what we would call trademark pirates, and we think what they're doing is not nice, it's not illegal. It is in fact totally allowed under trademark law. Facebook had similar problems in China, and we'll talk more about foreign language marks in a minute, but like they weren't able to, there was another mark that was similar to Facebook already registered in China, and it was hard for Facebook to get a registration, and again, very expensive legal battle, and often you sometimes have to acquire the rights. So this first to use, first to file distinction is very important for international registration. Bill, you're muted.
Oh, muted.
If I could point out from a practical standpoint, I think it's important to note that if you're representing a franchisor and talking to anyone in a first to file jurisdiction, it's equally important, if not more important, because you might not know where your mark is going yet, or what you're exactly going to file. It's very important to lay out the rights and make sure that you're protecting yourself when you do either an LOI or whatever else, but make sure the binding terms include something where there's no non-circumvention where they can go around you. They represent, acknowledge that you own the marks. They have no rights to them. And the only way they get them is through a definitive agreement down the road. But there are war stories out there, and I know we don't have time to go into them, but plenty of times where clients talk to someone that they thought was a great prospect in Singapore or China, and then next week they find out that these guys went ahead and filed their application for their mark. And the cost and annoyance and resources that you have to put into that can be easily prevented by doing proactive measures. And I think you'll hear that throughout this whole thing. The ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The other reason to do international trademark protection is to really create assets for your company and show that you're doing the proper activity to protect your brand around the world. That becomes so important when you're trying to get financing from investors or you have an exit strategy. It's going to be something that people are looking at, and you don't want to be presenting a piecemeal situation where you have the rights in the US and Canada, but these infringers, they're not infringers, right? Like they're pirates
Right.
maybe, but other people have the rights in these other countries. That's a really complicated problem. And so it is this ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. It's also important as you're moving internationally to do some global trademark searching. You can't do the same level of clearance searching in every country globally, but you can do some searching. And the searching is a little easier globally because of the registration rights. You're only looking at what else is already registered there because that's what's important in those countries. Whereas in the US, you have to focus on who might have common law rights that predate you. But doing some and understanding like your brand, does it work internationally? Is there another company already using similar brands? Like, are you going to be able to take your brand, globally if that's part of your strategy? The other thought is in a franchise system, when you adopt a mark, whether it's in the US or internationally, you have to be concerned about your franchisee's perspective on whatever risk tolerance you might have. So in a corporation, when a CEO or CMO makes a decision about like, I understand there's similar marks out there, or I understand that there's these junior users, like I'm going to go with this mark anyway, that becomes a company decision that everyone just falls in line behind, right? Decision is made. When you're in a franchise system, obviously you have all these other owners who have a vested interest in the decisions you've made, and it can continue to kind of pop up over time and they question what you've done. And so there's more stakeholders to involve to think about in those decisions. And Shelley's got a good story of a situation she's handling in China.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we talk about doing clearances, and that's a really important thing. But clearances are going to show you what other marks are being filed, what people are doing to file other marks or to claim rights to marks in those jurisdictions. A lot of infringers or a lot of issues that you have are not going to come up through clearances. They're going to come up through franchisees telling you what's happening in a market. So, it's really interesting as you think about, as a franchisor, you have so many additional stakeholders and a different set of people to think about than maybe a company that is all corporate stores. So, we had a situation not that long ago where we had, it was actually brought to us by franchisees. And we've had these in a couple of different places. China is a famously difficult place to try to continue to defend your mark. And so a lot of them are in China. But, the franchisees are very concerned because they see a copycat location. or they see a location that's using a mark that's very similar, playing off of our mark, not something that they've registered, but something that they're just using somewhere. And they can pop up a number of locations before anybody ever sees them or you even are aware of them. And so then you're playing a little bit of catch up. And so as you're looking at what you're going to do, it's really important to bring the franchisees along. It really is important to the franchisees on the ground that they have a voice. And so, in this situation, how we handle these situations, we are having regular calls with our franchisees and their attorneys, along with our in-house legal department, our business people, and our outside trademark attorneys. You got a lot of people on these Zoom calls. They're happening late at night or early in the morning to accommodate everybody's schedule. And you're talking about what is the strategy? What are we doing to address the issue? In those conversations, it's a delicate balance as a franchisor, because you need to make sure that as a franchisor, you remain the decision maker around how you are defending and how you are managing your portfolio of marks. But it's also very important to take the input of the franchisees and to really understand what impact it's having on them. One thing I would say as a warning is, franchisees, they want to be very helpful. They want to, they want to play their part. And so, you've got to be very careful. And as a franchisor, you've got to control things like cease and desist letters. You've got to control things like filing lawsuits against potential infringers. Franchisees will offer to do it. It may be perceived that it's easier for them to do that because they're in market and they speak the language and all of the things. But it really is important to keep control and to continue to put out to the world and to infringers who is clearly the owner of the mark, which is the franchisor, and who are the stakeholders, which are the franchisees. So that's just something, as you think about your stakeholder conversations, make sure you're including people, but also make sure that you're delineating the roles and responsibilities very carefully.
Yeah, and if you guys don't mind, I'll jump in right here, because I think one of the things you said is very important. You have to keep the franchisees involved. And if you have a master franchise relationship, it was what happens a lot of times internationally, the proactive side of this and foreign character protection, figuring out what the marks that are available to you. And it's not just talking to attorneys or people that are doing clearance searches, it's talking to your marketing team. And I'm just going to quickly, if you guys don't mind, go through the 4 different ways you can go out to a foreign country. You can use the same exact mark you're using in the US. That's one. Number 2, you could do a simple translation. That would be like Williams Tavern being Taberno de Guillermo, right? If I was going to do that. But Pollo Campero, for example, uses the same mark everywhere it goes. So there's the first 2 examples. Third is transliteration, and that's when you're moving from the Roman numerals or the typical characters and letters and alphabet we use to go to a entirely different alphabet and language over there in like countries like China, the Middle East, and the MENA era generally, Middle East, North Africa. In that situation, a good example would be apple. Apple is a term that means something in Chinese, and it's pingu, I believe. I don't judge me on my pronunciation, but it's basically a translation, but into different characters: Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese, or Japanese, any of those characters in those jurisdictions. The fourth one is an interesting one that happens with a lot of clients where they have a coined term. Again, it could be anything from Xerox to whatever else, but it isn't a term that actually means anything that could translate into Chinese or whatever else. So in those circumstances, a lot of times what we counsel our clients to do is go for maybe try to look at least a phonetic equivalent, which is basically putting words in a different language and different script that kind of sounds like your mark, but really doesn't mean that, but it gains that secondary meaning and acquired distinctiveness similar than to marks do in the United States. Probably the best example of a phonetic equivalent, the most success story would be Coca-Cola, who came up with Kiku Kele in China, and that means tasty and happy. So not only did it have something that sounded like their mark, when people actually thought about it, they're like, it's tasty and it makes me happy. Good marketing. So again, just to re-emphasize, it's important to not only talk to your legal team about this, it's important to talk to your marketing team and share that stuff with them as well. Share the burden on that. The reason I say all this is because there's lots of bad examples. You guys can look it up online, 15 bad brand mistakes or whatever. But, the Chevy Nova in Mexico, when they didn't change the name and Nova means no go, that wasn't really good for a car. You might think that people learn their car manufacturers learn that trick or learn from that mistake, but even in 2018, Audi put out what's called an e-tron vehicle, their first electric vehicle. Sounds so great till you get to France, and e-tron translates roughly into turd. I don't know how else to say it, but I mean even the biggest companies in the world struggle with this because they try to take shortcuts. So the ounce prevention again, worth the pound of cure. Make sure you figure out your strategy, and any one of them can work in any jurisdiction. And as I think Shelley would say, Dairy Queen does different things. Sometimes even changes their mark to maybe something a little bit different. But it's really about looking at each jurisdiction independently, but also having a comprehensive strategy.
And to that point, like when we talk about international trademark protection, like who do you use for this, right? Do I need an international law firm with offices all over the world? That's typically not how it works. You're typically working with your US trademark counsel who has an international practice. So like if not your existing US counsel and you know, a referral sometimes to another US counsel that does more international work. Because in a lot of countries, IP work is not done at the same law firm as maybe a franchise agreement is done. It will vary. Sometimes in many countries, trademark registrations are only handled by boutiques and specialized trademark firms. But anyway, typically U.S. Global Trademark Council will have a network of trusted kind of foreign associate lawyers that they've worked with for a long time to help you with this thing. It's not something people should generally be contacting foreign law firms about directly because it's just such a specialized area. It's the kind of thing you work with your U.S. Trademark Council on to speak the same language to their counterparts around the world. But in addition to counsel, I want to emphasize what Bill was saying, which is it's marketing teams, it's development teams. There's like a lot of elements to an international trademark strategy, and all those pieces kind of working together is the best approach.
Absolutely. So let's advance the slide, Tara, and let's look a little bit at some of the ways that we need to prioritize and how we use limited resources and can still protect our brands in all of these markets.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. So I've worked with startup franchisors who are selling that, you know, franchising their first unit, and I've worked with Fortune 500 global product companies, right? And what I always say is like everyone's budget is limited. Like nobody has all the money to do everything they want to do. So it's always about prioritization, right? Regardless of the size of your budget, you're going to take the size of your budget and figure out the best things you can do with what you've got. But when you're talking internationally, that $3,000 per trademark fee can seem reasonable. Doesn't seem like, I mean, it's not that much money, right? But then you go times 10 countries, okay, that's $30,000. And maybe you actually have 3 marks. Maybe you have a word mark, a design logo, and like a tagline, right? And now we're at $100,000, right? So I always say it's exponential when you start going international. And you go to, and so I think you look at which marks do you want to prioritize? Is it just the word mark? Is it like the logo? Like how many marks are we going to do? And you might have a portfolio of a much larger US portfolio where you have taglines and product names, but you don't take those internationally. You shouldn't be taking 5 different marks around the world. You take 2 maybe, right? Maybe 3. And so like in Dairy Queen's case, we focus on DQ, what the acronym when we can get it, DQ, the ellipse logo, Dairy Queen, and then Blizzard, which is a key product. But we don't try to protect like Peanut Butter Parfait or Dilly Bar or some of the other very important product names that we might have registered in the US and maybe also in Canada. So focusing on which marks are you going to try and register?
Yeah, and let me jump in for a second. I'll tell you, like that is an internal education process, right? And again, think about stakeholders internally. You really need to talk with your marketing teams and your international teams about what is your strategy. Bring them along and help them understand. You know, they think that all the taglines that they want to use should all be registered until you start talking about how much it's going to cost and then the fact that you have to actually defend them. So it's really a conversation that needs to start with the legal department and the attorneys, but really needs to be inclusive of some of those business partners as well.
And then like you cannot use the circle R where you don't have a mark registered in a jurisdiction. So then you have to look at what are my global materials going to look like? Because I can't put the R on a menu board for Peanut Butter Parfait if I'm going to push that out to a bunch of other places, right?
Exactly.
You also look at goods and services, right? How might my goods and services vary in international jurisdictions? Dairy Queen does more treat centers, so like maybe the ice cream services are more important and we focus on those classes in some international markets as opposed to the hot food goods and services. And then you, again, if you might have more goods and services covered in the US, you think about what am I actually going to take internationally. The funny thing is sort of the opposite, which is that because you don't have these use requirements in foreign countries, you actually you could have filed more broadly. You could file for a longer goods description in a certain class in your foreign markets. Because you don't have those use requirements that we have in the US. So there's this goods and services analysis.
If I could just jump in on it, sorry, just
Sure.
real quick. I just wanted to mention one person you should be talking about that we didn't mention yet. And when you talk about goods and services, is the master franchisee or your franchise partner, because they're going to be on the ground. And we'll talk about this a little more later. But globalization and accounting for cultural sourcing, import export issues can sometimes impact how you should draft your goods and services in your application from the start.
Yes, right. That's super important because like some places might not let you import certain goods if it, with a mark on them, if you don't have a registration for that mark, right?
Right.
So yeah, there are some local considerations that might say you have to do a little bit more. China, you can't manufacture some things without some registrations because proper factories won't do it. So there's other considerations around goods and services. And then which countries, right? Like there's 200 trademark jurisdictions in the world. You cannot register in all of them. I mean, I have clients who register in all of them, but generally because they actually do business around the world. I represent MoneyGram, right? And they have money transfers all over the world. So you really have to focus on like, what's my priority? Which 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or Dairy Queen operates in 20 plus countries, but they probably have coverage in at least 60.
Yeah. Yep.
Because for defensive reasons, because we don't want a Dairy Queen opening up in Angola, right? And we wouldn't be able to stop it if it did, right? So I think you look at where are you actually offering, where might you want to offer, and that's really getting your development team. And we all know that in franchise, sometimes your development plan is where did I get a phone call from with somebody interested in buying a franchise?
Right.
And so that suddenly now we're interested in developing there. But understanding that it's going to take 2 years to get a registration and like that can slow things down and you're sort of unprotected while you're trying to negotiate a deal somewhere. So being somewhat thoughtful about where might we go and get those registrations ahead of time can be helpful. So we look at, obviously size of revenue, size of opportunity. That's why sort of you tend to go sort of US, Canada, EU, maybe Australia, big market, English speaking. People tend to go there, UK, right? Those are some of but it depends on your business, obviously. And then really creating a strategic plan. That's something that I just kind of focus my practice on is kind of strategic trademark management and not being as reactive and really spending your budget in the best way possible. And so it's really aligning your strategy with your organization's goals. And as we've been saying, talking to the business, talking to the development team, talking to marketing, the C-suite, right? Like where do we want to go? What are our key markets? What are our possible new jurisdictions? Do we want to strengthen protection in a jurisdiction that's emerging for us? For companies,
And then what can we afford, right?
Right, and you're weighing all these things, right?
All the things, right? Yes.
Right. But I think you have to identify what all the things are and then decide with your business strategy, what's the priority.
Absolutely.
And then if you're an existing international portfolio company, right, you already are in a number of countries, we take over portfolios all the time where it's like, well, decisions were made at some point that nobody can really understand what you have now, but you have sort of a bigger unwieldy international portfolio. And then the question is like, let's do an audit. Let's do let's figure out like, where do you have coverage? Where do you need coverage? Why do you have these things? Could we let some of these things go because we can save money there to bolster places where we need? So doing kind of gap analysis of like, where would we like to be? And also like, can we prune this portfolio? Like different decisions are made over time. And so sometimes you get 10 years into something and it's not clear why we have all these registrations.
Right.
And then, as I mentioned, like creating a budget and understanding that budget is made up of all different kinds of trademark work. There's filing applications, prosecuting applications, like maintaining registrations and renewals, but there's also monitoring, enforcement activities, some analysis and strategy money. And when you figure out these different components, you can say, like, even if your budget was 10 grand, I'd say, well, maybe we could do some analysis and strategy. We'd have a renewal due next year. We have money for enough an application, and we should put a watch service in place, right? Like I could maybe do all that for 10 and take that times 100 when you're looking at a bigger international portfolio, but it's really always the same 5 buckets, and deciding like what's most important for your organization.
Yeah, and then Jen, we talked a little bit already about offensive and defensive strategies, sort of, there's different reasons that you go in. You want to just touch on that for a minute, and then we'll move on to some of the franchise specific things.
Yeah, so as we said, there's sort of the offensive, where might we go? Where do we want to develop? Where would we want to be able to go into? There's also defensive, where do we want to stop somebody else from using the mark? And again, the defensive portfolio might be a little bigger, but it's maybe just like the main mark, or 2 marks, just to make sure nobody else does it, because it's so much cheaper to get a $3,000 trademark registration than find out somebody's operating a Dairy Queen in Angola, and for me to send them a cease and desist letter is like $2,000, right? Like, and we could have just prevented that. So I also think, like, understanding the timing from your development plan, as I mentioned, it's 2 years to maybe get a registration in a lot of countries. So kind of getting ahead of the curve, or starting that process as soon as possible when you think you might have interest. And then sometimes when we even look at a gap filling analysis, like I just mentioned, we would look at like, oh yeah, we really would like to file these 10 applications, but we don't have the budget this year. So we're going to plan to do that over 3 years. And, we're just going to know that in 3 years we'll be caught up, and we can divide that money. So be really thinking ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So maybe we can go to the next slide, and Bill can talk a little bit about some of the things that franchisors and the franchise industry needs to think about as we look at trademark protection.
Sure, I appreciate it, guys. So this is any one of these topics we could spend an hour on, probably. I kindly had my team help me pare down my notes here in my outline. But listen, all this isn't in priority, legal, pragmatic, operational. They all interplay with one another. So just consider that as we go through it in a little bit more detail. But we'll start with legal, because I'm an attorney. Why not? Legal requirements for franchising internationally, separate and apart from trademark. If you're a franchisor, you have franchise regulations in some jurisdictions. That's not the purpose of this call, but you guys got to understand that there's a lot of jurisdictions, and it varies widely what kind of pre-sale disclosure documents you have to have and give to a prospect in certain jurisdictions prior to awarding or offering a franchise. And as part of that, and in some jurisdictions a lot more than others, they highly, highly review and scrutinize what you're saying about the trademarks. Some jurisdictions want you to make sure they have an application filed at least for it in their country before they'll even approve the franchise registration. So stuff to consider there is, obviously, as a franchise practitioner, is to make sure you have that stuff down cold. And you only know that once your client has talked to, or you guys have talked to internally with your internal sales team and marketing team and internal legal. But the real key here is, and the thing is trademark specific, is the fact that separate and apart and totally in addition to any pre-sale franchise regulations is, in some states, what's called a recordal of the trademark license or an agency agreement. And the tricky part is, a lot of times these are the guys that don't really have franchise regulations. So as franchise counsel, sometimes it doesn't hit your radar. You think the UAE, well, they're part of the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council. I know they don't really have real franchise regulations. They have a code of conduct or something, but nothing specific. You might not think you have to do anything once that trademark, or once you sign the master franchise agreement or franchise agreement for that country. That would be a mistake, because, the UAE, as well as some other countries in the GCC, the Caribbean, the MENA area I spoke about before, North Africa, Middle East, and even Latin America. I think there's probably about 19 to 20 countries that you have to actually file and record any trademark license whatsoever, even beyond if it's not a franchise. You have to record that license in order for it to be effective, if you ever want to enforce it. And even though there's probably about 10 or 12 other jurisdictions in those areas where it doesn't say it's required, but good luck enforcing your agreement if you don't have that registration. So even though it's not a statutory requirement, it's a practical requirement if you want to stop a third-party franchisee or sub-franchisee in a different jurisdiction from using your mark. So that's super important on that end. The next part is I guess we'll go to pragmatic. Let's go to operational considerations. Skip around for a minute. I think it's super important that, when you're in-house counselor, or even, an officer director of a company, you have to start thinking about the ownership of your intellectual property internationally. Chances are domestically the franchisor owns it, or an affiliate that probably was an affiliate operator from the start. Maybe you have an IP company domestically that will own those trademarks. And you might say, well, why would I do it any different internationally? Well, the answer is it's kind of it's due to a couple of factors, and we'll get into those. But the idea is it going to be the franchisor that owns it? Is it going to be an international franchisor? Is it an international IP company? You have to figure out the lay of the land. Talking to your accountants and tax partners is also important for this, because there's withholding tax, VAT, comparable taxes on any license royalty agreement. So your initial franchise fee, your royalty fees, all that kind of stuff are all covered by these withholding tax that can be between 5 and 30% from the U.S. taking money in from another country that's a license. So sometimes where you own that mark or where the licenses are and how you figure all that out, it might make sense to have someone in between you and your U.S. entity, because the taxation treaties that people have between those two entities might make it less than what it would be if it went direct to you. And that's basically takes an accountant, a lawyer, sounds like the beginning of a joke, and the franchisor team to actually get into that and dig down deep and try to figure out the best strategy, because that ends up being the tail that wags the dog most times. The other part about that is, once you figure out ownership, make sure that the trademark license, there is a trademark license to the franchisor entity who's going to be accepting that money. Because that's the one that's going to be subject to the withholding taxes, the royalties, the fees, whoever's signing the actual franchise agreement.
Yeah, and those things are really important to think about at the upfront, to your point. And again, cross-functionally this time with your finance and your tax folks and your attorney, because you could end up having to fix it later, right? After you could have a year where you're like, oh, that's an unintended consequence, and then you have to come back and fix it.
Yeah, and if you think legal counsel is expensive it's the pound of cure, talk to an accountant, because I promise you that's when things get delayed and things can get messed up. And a lot of times audited financials are part of the annual filing. So you never want to freeze up somebody, a client or yourself, if you're the franchisor, which I think 70% of you on this call are. It's great. That's something you should be talking about with your attorney and your tax people right away, because those international tax treaties can certainly act as a buffer to some of this 5 to 30% fees that are getting paid that would otherwise be due.
So you want to talk a little bit about a couple of the practical things, and then we'll do a quick touch on Madrid protocol?
Sure. Pragmatic focus points means if I'm an attorney and I'm representing a franchisor, that's how I'm thinking about things. It starts with the prospects. And as I said before, make sure there's NDAs, non-circumvention, and proper contractual language in anything before you go into detail with this guy too much. You got to lock him up on the trademarks, and it's probably the most important thing, because it's a hard spaghetti strand to unravel if it gets tangled up. It can be a real mess. The last part on globalization is the need to balance, as you're working with your franchise partner in an international jurisdiction, the need to balance globalization and recognizing that in this country they celebrate Ramadan, so we might need to do like McDonald's did and put a curtain over our Big Mac or our M. Smart things that you can look at ahead of time to obviously recognize cultural, possible goods and services, import, export, all those issues, but then balancing that against what you actually have now as your brand and where you want it to go. You don't want to get too far away, but even Shelley, I think you would say Dairy Queen, one of the most well-known franchises in the world, does things differently with their marks in certain areas. And I think it's a practical evaluation you have to make. And last thing I would say is it should always be evolving. Just because you did your homework last year doesn't mean it's not new homework this year. You should always be constantly monitoring that. And there's obviously services that can help you with that, third party.
Absolutely. So again, we'll move a little bit now, thanks, Bill, to a couple of strategy ideas for, like I said, particularly maybe for newer franchisors who are looking at, or franchisors who are looking at newly expanding into multiple markets. There's some strategies for keeping for streamlining it and keeping the cost down a little bit.
So if you could advance the slide, Tara. Yeah. So the Madrid Protocol, we can't have an international trademark presentation without talking about our good friend, the Madrid Protocol, which is a treaty that 113 plus countries have signed this treaty. that again harmonizes trademark law in a different way than I talked about. You still have this independent like registration system in every jurisdiction, but WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, has been around for since like the late 1800s, and they work with countries all around the world, and they try to create a streamlined, cost-effective international registration system that makes it more easy and cost-effective for small and medium businesses to protect their brands globally. They have been working on it for decades. Every year they add new countries to this mix. The countries have to have an electronic filing. They have to have similar trademark laws. So it's a multi-year process for a country to get added. But they are now up to, the US only joined in the 2000s. So it's a newer system, right? Like to the US legal system. But Europe's been involved for decades longer. And really, it's a different way of filing an international trademark. So as I said, you would normally go to your US counsel, they would go to their trusted partners and other trademark lawyers in other countries, they'd fill out the application, they'd send it in, because like only a local trademark lawyer can submit an application. This Madrid protocol system just skips that step. It's the US lawyer sends the application to WIPO, WIPO sends it to all the trademark offices. And so you save a third to 2/3 on the cost, right? And because the examination is so much easier in most countries, normally you don't need local counsel for this process to go forward. So when we talked about $3,000 per mark and it's $30,000 to go into 10 countries, well, I can quote it to you that way. And I can also say we could also file via the Madrid protocol, and it's $10,000 for protection in 10 countries. So you should always be thinking about this process as an alternative. There's pros and cons and situations that are more effective and not effective, less effective for the Madrid protocol, but it is a real cost savings when you're talking about cost-effective trademark protection. The other thing is it's much more effective long-term. It's going to be so much cheaper to manage your international portfolio if more of it is via Madrid, because when you change addresses or you change names or company names, or you assign the marks to a different entity, within your organization, corporate company structure or outside in a sale, it's, when you have to go to each of these countries to do something, anything, assume it's $1,000 to talk to them about anything. I need to change my address. I need to do this. And you need to do those things in order to have valid trademark rights. All of a sudden it's, a bunch of money. But in Madrid, it's one filing, $500, send it to WIPO, tell them your address changed, tell them your name changed, and then they go do it with all the other countries.
Yeah,
So
we moved our corporate headquarters a few years ago for Dairy Queen, and we spent about 3 years. Like we had to make a plan. How are we managing this? Where are we filing? How are we changing all the addresses? It was a process. So something that seems like it should be easy, we should just be able to send someone something that says we're changing our address. Much more complicated than you think. And something like Madrid helps out a lot in those situations.
right. And I will say that the Madrid system, you have to have a base US registration. So it can be the one place it's less useful is a brand new US system to say, like, I'm going to take a brand new mark that's not even approved or registered in the US now, and I'm going to try and push it internationally. But most of the time, the way franchising works is like you're established in the US for a couple of years before you're thinking of going internationally, often 5 maybe. And so your US registrations are not only registered, but they're incontestable. And those are great candidates for then using the Madrid system. So I really recommend working with counsel that understands the Madrid system and at least understanding the pros and cons and the expense savings, because it is a great system.
Jennifer, I just have one thing. Even if you're not going to go into all the countries, because this is like Ruth Chris, you pick your states. It's a la carte. You want this
Yeah.
jurisdiction, this jurisdiction. I would recommend you always do it once, because even that first one, even if you designate one country, you've now gotten something hopefully on the WIPO register. And that blocks everybody else who wants to go into 30 countries or whatever if they try to go through Madrid protocol, because that's that middle piece. And if you have a WIPO international registration, I think that can
It doesn't block them. It doesn't block them, but it does make it easier. So like, yes, you can pick, so you can go in once and just do Canada, right? I'm just going to do Canada. It's about the same price probably to do Canada nationally or Canada via Madrid. But now you've got an IR. And when you want to go to Europe, you just check a box. And it's like, then you want to add 2 more countries, you just check a box, and then you can take that. You don't have to decide all at once. That IR will be around for 10 years, and you can just keep adding countries as you go. I saw a question just pop up about
Yep.
Madrid.
Yeah,
So
it was about,
consolidate. Yes,
Yep, it
so
was,
yes, you can take, this is super cool. If you have 3 US registrations, like Dairy Queen has one for ice cream in class 30, one for restaurant services in class 43, one for franchising in class 35. I can take 3 US registrations, combine them into one international registration that's 3 classes, and make an international 3-class registration. And then like take that and go push that out everywhere else. So that's kind of a cool thing.
there was a disclosure question that came in, around, it came in a couple minutes ago, but is it advisable to list all the registered trademarks in the FDD or only the ones that relate to the jurisdiction in which the FDD applies?
I'm
So
happy to take this one if you want, or go
yep,
ahead.
go ahead. Yep.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question because it was one of the things I wanted to mention on my last slide and I didn't mention, but it's super important to be transparent in the FDD as to the current status of the marks there. I don't care if you don't have them registered, kind of take whatever you acknowledge in the LOI. And I always do it even in the FDD, even in the master or franchise agreement I sign, if it's international, you're talking, and I just talk about the status of them. I wouldn't, if you have to put something in there and you haven't filed any applications, you can do one section that says status of marks in China or the PRC, and you can kind of just acknowledge what it is that we haven't done anything yet. We're deciding. We're going to make that decision in short order, but it's going to be something close to this or modified from it. Franchisors always have those rights, but of course, people want to know in a disclosure document. So again, great question. Under that, I'll put, look, if I don't have anything good to put up there, I will talk about the United States and what we do there. And that, whatever you've discussed with them, don't be afraid to literally explain almost like a one-off for, because a lot of times when you go internationally, it's a master franchise. You're only doing one anyway. Explain to them what's going on and keep it consistent in the FDD. Best thing is transparency. So they
Right.
cannot come back and say, I wouldn't have bought had I known.
And and specifically to the part of the question that was asking about, which jurisdictions, information do you have to include in the FDD? You should look at the FDD requirements for each of the jurisdictions. So look at your pre-sale disclosure obligations, and it will tell you what you need to put in. Generally, you're not going to put in your global trademark portfolio into a single FDD for a single country. You're going to put in what is applicable to that country. And then to Bill's point, if you don't have something that's applicable to the country, or if you feel like your disclosure would be, it's still appropriate and it would be helped by putting in what you have in the US as a original jurisdiction, then you can put that in as well. But no, you don't have to apply, you don't have to put in your whole portfolio into all of these disclosure documents. That's a great question. All right, excellent. So let's talk a little bit about enforcement. We have a few minutes, and then maybe if we have any time left, we'll ask for some more questions. But keep putting those questions in the chat. That's super helpful. So let's talk. Once you've got registrations, now you're monitoring, and now what are you doing from an enforcement perspective?
So it's really sort of what you do in the US, but on a bigger scale, right? We often have a watch service in place, watching your marks for filings in the US. We can do a global watch. It's not that much more money. It's not like $1,000 in the US to do a watch and then $1,000 everywhere else. It's sort of like $2,000 to watch it globally. So I would say a watch service that's more global is a good thing. Then you have the same sort of issues. As issues bubble up, and they will often come through your franchisees with issues, or through your watch where you see somebody applying to register something. It's the same sort of, cease and desist letters, potentially oppositions to their trademark applications, rarely sort of having to do an injunction to go to court to try and stop something from happening. And obviously in the trademark area, if you're familiar with the US, it's the same globally. You often settle disputes with coexistence agreements where you sort of delineate each party's rights and how we can kind of coexist, and some restrictions on each party's use. And so there's a lot of settlement and coexistence in trademark disputes generally. That's true all over the world. There are some countries we want to talk about, high-risk jurisdictions. Russia, China, India are all known as like places where there's a lot of piracy and infringement. Sometimes those are places you might register in your top 10 just to kind of get there, to get ahead of it, because trying to stamp it out once, if you don't have any rights there, is near impossible. Obviously, the situation in Russia has changed with the sanctions. You can still obtain registrations, but like your ability to do anything in Russia right now. But historically, that was a place where it made sense to get in first, because someone else will try and do it. And so you might just have to spend more resources there, because there are places where people are just aggressively infringing.
Yep.
Vulnerability is an interesting concept I want to talk about. That's this cancellation for non-use. Even though you own a trademark registration in a country and you don't have to have use to apply and you don't have to have use to get the registration, if you haven't used the mark in a country, you are vulnerable to cancellation. And the third party can come and just tell the trademark office to cancel your registration because you haven't used it in 3 or 5 years, depending on the jurisdiction. That's just a risk you live with. I pointed out because it's, just owning a registration doesn't give you all the rights forever. And that is another place where we've been moving some clients to the Madrid protocol where they might already have a registration, but that registration is vulnerable. So let's get them a new registration under the Madrid protocol because we're going to buy them 3 more years before they're vulnerable. And we're going to streamline the portfolio long-term for management. And we're not really giving up the priority of their old registration in this country because their old registration isn't worth much because it's vulnerable.
Yep.
And then foreign judgments. Bill was just going to talk a little bit about the issues and challenges of trying to enforce and litigate abroad.
Oh, you're muted, Bill.
Oh,
Thanks, guys. On foreign judgments and just tolerance generally, it's obviously a case by case basis. And again, don't mean to sound like a broken record, but now's the time to talk to the operations team instead of the marketing team and people like that, when you're deciding how far away people can go or whether if they're in your system or outside your system, those people are important too, because it takes their resources as well. Foreign judgments, in my experience, having done deals in Asia, in certain Asian jurisdictions and whatever else, a lot of times when you have some sort of, either it's a former franchisee or a third party, if you're willing to go to war over it and they're doing something wrong, you want immediate relief, preliminary injunctive relief. And that's not always the easiest thing to get through arbitration or whatever provision it says in the franchise agreement. A lot of times you got to go either right to the jurisdiction where the offending action is being occurred, Asia or wherever else, and get a judgment there. Or you have to get a judgment from the arbitrator and then get it enforced by the court in that jurisdiction. I can tell you this, that in my experience, even though there's treaties out there where they say the courts in that jurisdiction will enforce an arbitration order or an arbitration decision, it's not always that easy in black and white. A lot of times for China, for example, they like to see China law actually govern the trademark issue before it even got to them. Maybe another court did it, but they want to see that China law was applied, not Illinois law or Pennsylvania law. So just things to consider there. The costs to do that are very expensive. So I guess the biggest thing is if you're going to go after preliminary injunctive relief, or you're looking for permanent injunctive relief via an arbitration action or demand being enforced in a foreign jurisdiction, I would talk to your counsel early and often about how quickly and what the best path is overall efficiently, even if it's not the most efficient up front, to attack this. And it might be going even where your agreement says you don't have to go to do it.
That's a great point. Actually enforcing your rights is a lot harder sometimes than just writing them out so that you have them. Ellen, did you have any final thoughts as we kind of tie up the end of the seminar here?
I'm good.
Shelley, not for me,
Yeah.
but thank you very much to all our panelists for putting on this great webinar. See, we have a couple of minutes left, so if anybody has any questions, just now is the time to pop it in the chat.
We actually left 2 minutes for questions. That's impressive.
On purpose, exactly as scripted.
Exactly. It's a big area and there's a lot to think about. And we probably got a lot of companies and attorneys with different levels of experience and different levels of where they are in their international journey. So different things will apply to people differently. So, hopefully we touched on a few things that are helpful for the people that took the time to come today and listen to it. I guess as from an overall perspective, this can be a complicated area and there's a lot of things to consider. So finding the right counsel is important. Communicating with with franchisees, the communication between franchisor and franchisee in these international markets is really important. A lot of times franchisees can be the best watch service of all. So as we look at, as you look at your relationships, make sure that those are conversations that are happening between franchisor and franchisee. What is the strategy? How are we protecting these marks? Because it really is a shared interest. between franchisors and franchisees to make sure that the protection of these trademarks is top of mind for all.
Great. So
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks to the IFA for sponsoring.
yes,
Thank
thank
you,
you so much,
Shelley.
Alan and Tara. I appreciate you guys.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all. Bye bye.